see. Welcome, welcome one and all to the Fluff to Stuff July Zoom gathering. Thank you so much for being here. Hello to those of you watching this on our YouTube channel as a replay. This month, July 2021, our special guest is Mina Philipp. I would say a fairly well-known fiber artist in the community and also the co-founder and my co-host for the Fluff to Stuff Spin and Make Along. I am going to spotlight Mina's video so that you can all see her even better. And we're going to get started with an interview, getting to know Mina a little bit better. So Mina, my friend, I'm going to pretend I don't know any of these things about you. When did you start spinning and why?
Okay, so hi, I'm Mina. I started spinning in, when was it? November 2018, I want to say, yeah, November 2018. I remember, and why was because it's a very unique story, and like I don't know anyone else who's had this happen to them, and I will be honest, when it first, okay, let me backtrack a bit. So a few months prior, I got a Ravelry message from someone who said that they worked for Kromsky, the company that make the spinning wheels, and they said that they enjoyed my podcast and that they wanted to collaborate with me, send me a spinning wheel, and in exchange for me to like share 3 posts about it on Instagram and talk about it on my podcast and stuff. And they didn't ask for like a dedicated video. They didn't ask for me to say anything in particular, just like share about my journey learning to spin, as it were. And I was like, is this for real? Like this doesn't sound like it's a real thing. This sounds like someone's trying to like prank me or something. Because sorry, I'm just gonna make sure I'm in focus because the camera's gone a bit funny. Okay. I was just like, this sounds like a little bit too good to be true. It's one of those things where it's like, this sounds too good to be true, it probably is, kind of situations. And so I Googled them, I looked it up and said, okay, this is like, okay, the company's legit, that's fine. Like I already knew who Kromsky were. I was like, okay, company's legit. This person seems to actually work for this company. Okay, and they left an email address at the end being like, if you're interested, email us. I was like, okay, well, I'll email them and see what happens, kind of thing, like fully expecting nothing to come of it at this point. And I looked up the spinning wheel they'd offered me and I was like, really? Like genuinely gobsmacked that they would want to do that. Anyway, so we chatted back and forth a few times. And yeah, they did. They sent me the spinning wheel. And so I got it at the end of October. They ended up sending it. I asked them to send it later than they originally were going to, just because I was traveling and things like that. So I was like, well, send it at this time so I get it once I've gotten back from my travels. So it's not like I didn't want it to like anything to go wrong because I wasn't around to receive it, as it were. So yeah, I got it at the end of October. And I remember because I went to Rhinebeck that year, and this was obviously prior to having received the wheel. And I remember I picked up a few things of fiber from Into the World, being like, and I'd always heard when you first learn to spin, you should spin with good fiber, like don't spin with crap fiber because it will be harder to learn. So I remember grabbing a couple of braids of fiber from Into the World and a bat as well, I believe. And that was the first fiber I bought. And then, yeah, when I got back and got the wheel, I set it up, and they actually sent me some fiber as well to mess around with. And so, yeah, I did. I learned to spin a little bit with that, and then just basically dove headfirst straight in, was watching tons and tons of videos on YouTube. I did the, is it JC Boggs Faulkner? Her craft C class from worsted to woolen or woolen to worsted, I can't remember which one, the one that everyone has done or everyone goes to. And yeah, it was kind of like it wasn't a rabbit hole, it was a cliff, and I was just jumping right off the edge at that point. I was like head first off this cliff, and I ordered from a few different fiber companies here in the UK and started playing around. And I remember did a lot of spinning over those 2 months between November and December, there was a lot of spinning content on my channel there as well. And I did a series of like, sharing videos of my learning process, and I shared lots of different spinning experiments that I was doing, and just yeah, enjoying the experience, and not so much worrying about the outcome, and just enjoying the actual learning aspect of it, and being like, well, it's yarn, it'll be useful for something, even if I don't know what it's going to be when I start out. So like one of the first full things that I spun was the braid that I got from Into the World, and I split it in half, and I did half of it as a 2-ply and half of it as a chain ply, because I wanted to see what would happen. Like, I was just experimenting. And then in the end, even though the 2 yarns came out at slightly different gauges, they weren't the same weight of yarn. One was a 3-ply, one was a 2-ply. My spinning was very chunky and funky and all sorts of weirdness. I knitted up into a hot water bottle cover, and I still use it. I have it. It was like one of the first things I spun, the first projects I knit out of it, and I love it because it's such a like strong memory for me now. It's like that's one of the first things I did, and I have it. I just don't know where it is. Otherwise, I would have brought it to show you. I feel so bad. That was one thing I had in my head. I was like, when I come to do this, when it's my month, I need to have that here to share, and I don't have it. So apologies.
It happens. It's just proof that life happens to all of us. And
it really does.
Those who don't know, Mina's had a big move this year, and anyone who's ever moved from one place to another can appreciate what it's like to not have everything at hand all the time anymore.
Yeah, we moved about 2.5 months ago, and we're actually in the middle of getting a lot of house internal stuff done in the house, like on like the floor where our bedrooms are, and on the ground floor as well. So everything is in chaos right now. So I was joking with Mars earlier, like I genuinely don't know where half of our stuff is at the moment. Like my husband asks me where something is, and I'm like, I really don't know. I have no clue. If you can't find it, I'm not going to be able to find it either. But yeah,
maybe there's a benefit to that, right? Less distraction,
yeah.
And a lot of focus. It's interesting to me that you said you started spinning by way of this cliff dive, and thanks to the Kromsky wheel being made available. Before that, had you, you're a knitter, and had you worked with Handspun before that?
I have been very fortunate enough to have had a chance to work with Handspun prior to that. One of my really good friends, her name is Sarah. She lives in Connecticut, actually, and I don't actually know how we got to know each other. I guess just through Instagram and chatting and stuff. And then a couple of times when I went to New York, she came down and met me, and we hung out, and we just became really good friends. And she's an amazing spinner, such a good spinner. And you know, as knitters do, when you meet up, you get gifts for each other. So I would buy her yarn, I'd bring her some yarn, she'd give me, and she would always give me Handspun. And so I was very fortunate. I was always very lucky to be a recipient of her Handspun. I always really appreciated it as well. And then she offered at one time, she offered to, she said, if there's any fiber that you like, you can buy it, send it to me, and I'll spin it for you. I was like, you serious? And she was like, yeah. I'm like, okay. So I did it a couple of times where I bought some fiber and I sent it to her, or when I saw her, I gave it to her, and she would spin it, and I'd be like, look, there's no pressure on like when you do this or how long it takes you to do it, because like I don't like doing that to people, especially if they're doing it for me as a gesture, as a gift. I'm like, take your time. There's no rush on it at all. And so, you know, whenever she had it done, she'd let me know. And like if I was coming to the US, then we'd meet up and she'd be able to give it to me then, or I'd pay her for the postage and she'd post it to me. So I was very fortunate to have received Handspun in the past. I did have some experience with spinning prior to getting to my wheel. And I say some experience with like quotation marks, because I tried a drop spindle once at a retreat that I went to in, when was it? 2016, I think it was. Early 2016, I went on a retreat, and someone there had a drop spindle and was showing people how to use it, and I gave it a go, and I actually still have the little nugget that I did spin. I did not enjoy it. Did not enjoy the drop spindle. It was too slow, just too finicky, just too many things that could go wrong. And like, I was like, at that point, I pretty much knew that if I was going to learn to spin, it would be on a wheel. But then I think it was a couple of years later, it was the summer of 2017, I went to a Fibre festival here in the UK, and I came across one stall where a guy was selling these, he called them hand spinners, So it's not a drop spindle. And again, if you've been a follower of my podcast for a while, you'll remember these. I'm having trouble. Sorry, my Apple Watch decided to talk to me. I'm just going to take it off because that's annoying. So he's selling these tools called hand spinners, and I believe he was Dutch. And it's basically what it is. Again, I have it. I just don't know where it is because I would have brought it out to show you. It's just a like a stick, and it has another stick on it, and you spin it around, and that's what a bogway spinner. Thank you, Carolyn. That's the one. A bogway spinner is what it's called. And you sort of spin it around, and that puts in the twist, and then you sort of like wrap it on. It's a bit like a drop spindle, but without the dropping aspect of it, which I liked the idea of. I was like, oh, there's no more dropping of the spindles. Great, that sounds perfect to me. Because that was one of the things that really annoyed me about the drop spindle, was that like, oh, if you drop it, then you got the whole palaver of picking it back up and all of that. So I spun a bit on the bogway spinner, mainly sort of like a couple of little mini skeins and things like that. But there again, it was just too slow for me. I still have it. I think it's a really fun tool. And I think if I ever teach my daughter how to spin, that would be a great beginning for her, because there again, there's none of that frustration of like dropping a drop spindle. Because especially if you're young, if you don't have much patience and that sort of thing, and I don't have a lot of patience, that sort of thing of like dropping things all the time can get really frustrating. So I think the bogway spinner is actually a really good introduction, good alternative to a drop spindle.
But do you feel like the introduction of fiber to yarn was there? So do you feel like that made it at least intriguing enough when the spinning wheel offer was made?
Oh yeah, I'd already decided that if I was ever going to become a spinner, it would be on a spinning wheel. And it was more just a case of the offer came at a time when I was in a position to accept it.
Yeah.
Because prior to that, when we lived in the Middle East, for those of you who don't know, I learned to knit when we were living in Dubai at the time. So that's where my knitting journey began, was in the Middle East, because of course it does. That's the most logical place. Right. But after there, we moved to New York. And at that point, that was really the time, maybe like about a year before we moved, and whilst we were in New York, was really when my interest in spinning started increasing, as it were. Yeah. But I just knew that it wasn't going to happen until I got a wheel. And I knew we weren't going to get a wheel whilst we lived in a tiny New York apartment, because where was I going to put it? You know, like where was I going to put a wheel? Like it's just, and also we had a baby. It was like, you know, it just wasn't a practical time to think about it. So it was just one of those things that I just put to the back of my mind. And I was like, well, I have someone who is willing to spin yarn for me whenever, if I did want a skein every now and again. So that was kind of like satisfying that urge for a while. But I was still really interested in learning the actual mechanic and actually doing it for myself. Because it is its own kind of magic, to be quite honest. But then
I love the use of that word magic, because the process at its core is fairly simple, but anyone that spins or even uses handspun can appreciate that it is pretty magical to just twist to fiber in different ways. And then
also like just explaining it. Also just explaining it to someone who's not even in the fiber arts, and they're just like, you do what? Like how does that work? But yeah,
and then you just tell them, don't worry about it, it's magic.
But it's like we moved back to the UK in the beginning of 2018. We actually ended up living with my family for a while whilst we figured out what we were doing, whether we were staying in the UK or moving abroad again, what was happening. And so the offer for the spinning wheel came literally maybe a couple of months after we've moved into our own place. We finally bought a place, we've moved in. I was finally in a position where I could accept a wheel because we finally had space for one. And I was like, oh, now I can actually have one. And that's great. So yeah, like I said, it was just one of those things. It was just perfect timing. And had it not come along, I probably would have eventually come round and got a wheel myself. It might have taken me a bit longer because it wasn't like on my mind at that particular point, because like I said, we just moved, things were settling down. It wasn't literally at the forefront of my mind, but then it came up and I was like, well, yeah, of course I'll have one. Why not? I'd be crazy to say no at this point, but like I said, had it not come along, I would have found my way there eventually. So it wouldn't have taken me that long to get there.
I love it. I'm just going to now switch things up a tiny bit and share with some of our friends here some of your spinning and some of the things that you've shared online.
Oh no.
Just a few.
Oh, okay.
A bit of
That's
eye
fine.
candy. We all love Fibre and Fluff eye candy. So what you're looking at here are just some Fibre prep shots and some of Mina's beautiful photography, showing both her hand spun yarn and some projects made from Fibre. And one of the things I really appreciate about you, Mina, is that you have a great way of combining a lot of different talents, not just in your spinning, but in your making in general. So the way you compose your photography, the types of yarns that you spin, and then the kinds of things that you create. Some of you may not know this yet. I'd be surprised if you don't, but Mina is a knitwear designer as well. So I feel like from the design perspective, you also have a whole other lens on yarn and how yarn can be used. But we're talking about spinning today. So one of our other popular questions is, what do you enjoy most about your spinning? We can see by these photos that you take care in turning fluff into stuff, but what do you enjoy in that process?
You know what? I love that it's very much, like you said, like I'm a knitwear designer, so my knitting is now my job, as it were. I actually can't remember the last time I knit a pattern that I hadn't designed that wasn't just a vanilla sock, as it were. Mm-hmm. So my knitting is my job. Like I love it. I love knitting, but anything I'm knitting is usually work related. Mm-hmm. So spinning, when it came along, was this amazing thing because it was my hobby. It took over that hole of like needing a hobby, whereas my hobby had become my job, which was the knitting. And so now there was that space for something else to come in and fill that hobby position, as it were, in my life. And then it became this thing where like my hobby can then feed into my knitting, my job, as it were. So I would spin fiber, spin yarn, and then I would design something with that yarn. And so it kind of interlinked the two together, as it were. But my spinning was never a job, and then like in the sense that I wasn't spinning to produce yarn to sell, as it were. Therefore, it's always maintained that hobby aspect for me. And that was the one thing that I realized when it came along, when I started learning it, that it was the thing that I was missing in my life. Like I said, I absolutely love my knitting, but there's something different about when you knit for knitting's sake and for just the pleasure of knitting, and then knitting as a designer, because you're always having to take notes, you're having to keep track of what you're doing, you're having to wear your yarn, or check your stitch patterns, and like there's all these other things you think about when it comes to designing that you don't have to think about when something is just a hobby. And so again, it was that joy and that initial again, it's that kind of like diving off a cliff aspect of just diving deep into like absorbing as much information as possible. That's the one. So when I did the same thing when I first learned to knit, I literally absorbed as much information as was physically possible from the internet when I was learning to knit. And I did the exact same thing with spinning. I literally watched as many videos as I could about different methods of spinning, different preps, different everything, like whatever I could find, I watched it, and probably watched it twice. And I kind of just call it learning by osmosis, just like absorb the information and then try it out and experiment and play. And that was the thing that I loved the most about like the whole process of learning to spin. And that's kind of what it brought for me. And then, now as I've gotten more experience with it, I kind of look at it from the lens of what can this fiber become and what can I do with my spinning to get it to what I want it to be, as it were. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah. So I feel like the question that's popped up in the chat relates to the opposite end of the spectrum. Normally we like to find out from our guests what is frustrating for them, but I'm going to actually use Ashley's question and let you answer. Ashley's asking, what has been your most difficult project? Is there anything that you've just put away and you just didn't want to touch ever again? Ashley has apparently just put a project in timeout. So I think we can all commiserate, but what about for you?
I don't think there's a project I've given up on yet when it comes to spinning. Like I said, I kind of think of my spinning as being really for fun. So I've never really put that kind of pressure on myself. But having said that, I did have an experience relatively recently. Mars, you'll actually remember because I remember sending you a photo of it. I have the skein here because I managed to rescue it. So I spun this fiber. It was 3 50-gram bats in kind of like a sort of a gradient. And I sort of split the bats in half and just spun half and half on each bobbin. So, and then I was going to 2-ply them together. And so the colors would somewhat line up, but they'd be somewhat overlap between the color changes just based on my spinning. And because they were bats, I'd spun them somewhat woolen, kind of like what I call a modified long draw. So long draw, but supported with my other hand a little bit. So it's not like a true long draw, a style of spinning. And I got all the way through plying, almost entirely all the way through plying 150 grams of fiber. I think I must have got to like the last 10, 15 grams when I realized I'd been plying it in the wrong direction. The whole bloody thing, the whole freaking thing. And I thought at first, I didn't realize it was the whole thing. At first I thought, oh, maybe it's just this last section of like the bat that I've done. Maybe somehow I got distracted because I was watching something on the computer at the same time. Maybe I got distracted and my wheel suddenly went the other way and I didn't notice and I just kept going. So I started just like pulling it out, going, oh, I'll just pull it out and I'll fix it. Because this has happened before, where it's happened just for a bit and then I've just undone it and fixed it. And I don't know if I can actually get the photo up on the screen at all, but I might be able to just show you on the camera. But so I kept going.
I think we can all relate to that oh no moment, and also the desire for it to not be as bad as we know it could possibly be. You're just hoping that maybe this is a small oopsie and not a major uh-oh.
So I just kept going. I kept going until I got to the end of the bobbin. And then I just had this pile of, let me just adjust the brightness on my camera. Maybe that will, that pile of squiggly singles on the floor. And I was just like, I sent the photo to Mars and Grace in our chat, and I was just like,
why me? Why? I just wanted, right, you just wanted to sit and have some time at the wheel. That's all. It's not asking much.
And it was literally just, I was like, you know what? I'll take a couple of hours, I'll apply this, and then I'll get on with my day. No, that's not what happened.
Not so much. Yeah.
I started fixing it, and the way you fix it that I found that works really well, and thankfully, to some degree, because I'd spun it woolen and the yarn, the fiber had been prepped woolen. Now I couldn't find the original listing when I purchased the yarn from Etsy, but from what I remember, it was a fairly woolly yarn fiber that was in the mix. I just can't remember what breed it was. So it wasn't like a super slick fiber, like a merino or something super soft. It's definitely more on the rustic side. The singles were pretty sturdy. The singles weren't just falling apart, thankfully. So all I did was I'd let a bit through, ply it the right way. So essentially unply it and then reply it in the section. So it just takes twice as long because you're untwisting and retwisting the ply in the right direction. So you're just like plying it twice as much in the right way this time. So I sat there and it took a long time. Thankfully, again, by some miracle, it did not tangle up at all. Like this pile on the floor was perfectly untangled the whole time. Don't ask me how. I sort of lucked out because I was fully expecting to have to like cut the fiber at some point and like lose a bunch of singles. But it was fine. I didn't lose any yarn, didn't lose any of the fiber. I had to stop partway through and just like put it aside. I was like, I actually need to get some work done. Did some
small
work.
Timeout. That was a small timeout.
It was like not even a day's worth of timeout. It was like a half-day timeout. And then I came back to it and I finished it. And
can we see the finished skein again? Oh,
and it's all done.
Worth it. I hope you feel it's worth it anyway.
Better, at least it survived. That was the main thing. It survived, and yeah, it turned out fine. Nothing.
And it looks like your goal to mostly line up the colors worked really well too.
Yeah, and it did. There was very little overlap actually. And I actually, both bobbins pretty much ended almost at the same time. I don't know how I managed it, to be quite honest. I got, like, again, I think everything, even though the plying went so wrong, everything else went so right that it kind of just like worked out okay in the end. But
Yeah, I love it. So our next question is one that you and Grace and I, we get this individually all the time, because anyone coming into a new craft would love to kind of reduce their ramp up time and get into what they believe that craft is going to be for them. So a beginner coming into spinning often wants to know, can I avoid some of the pitfalls? Can I get to the part where I'm, making yarn that I'm happy with, maybe a bit sooner, by asking people who have done it before. So a common question we get, and one we have for you, is what advice do you have for new spinners?
don't skimp on getting good fiber, and don't skip out on the prep. Those, I find, are the two key things to actually enjoying the spinning process and getting more out of it, and actually getting what you want out of it at the end of the day. So the first one is pretty obvious. If you buy crappy fiber, you're not going to enjoy the spinning process. So buy good fiber.
So I know that some of our friends that are joining us in this particular gathering have been spinning. Many of them have been spinning for a while, but if you would describe some things that you think are not fiber that would be great for a beginner, what would some of those characteristics of not so great fiber be?
Okay, so like when you go onto Etsy and you're looking at like fiber listings, I would say first of all, go with some tried and true. If you're looking at indie dyers or indie fiber producers, you're not going to like big box shops, for example. Like if you're looking on Etsy, go to the ones that you've, maybe get recommendations from other spinners about who they like to buy fiber from, because that's usually a safe bet. They're not going to recommend someone that they don't enjoy. And there again, I'd say stick to like medium staple length fibers, things like BFL, Shetland, and also ones that are a little bit more grabby, because then you're not less likely to break your singles as you're spinning. So I know it's like pretty common, everyone says stay away from merino when you're learning, but having said that, when I got my spinning wheel, the fiber that the people from Komsky sent me was merino. It was fine. I did spin a little bit of it and it was fine. But there again, once I moved on from that and I actually picked up that braid of Into the World fiber, or that bat from Into the World, I immediately noticed the difference between the quality and the prep that had gone into making that fiber compared to the fiber that I got with the wheel. Not that there was anything wrong with the merino, but it was slightly compacted, so it needed some prep. And I didn't know that when I first pulled it out of the bag, because I didn't know what I was looking at. That sort of thing only comes from experience, and it comes from making those mistakes. So there's nothing wrong. If you make that mistake, there's nothing wrong with that. You learn from it. Like everything you do, if it doesn't go right, then you still learn what not to do next time. And yeah, like I've never ventured into buying fleeces or getting a fleece or accepting a fleece from someone. It's just not something I want to touch. I'm not interested in having to deal with cleaning a dirty fleece. I have 2 cats and a toddler. I do enough cleaning in my life, in my day-to-day life. I don't need to clean a fleece. I'm good without that. But yeah, there again with fleeces, I've heard, again, no first-hand experience, but I've heard that like you want to avoid certain types of fleeces, or certain like I just noticed it came up in the chat. Someone says a free fleece is usually free for a reason, sort of thing. And like, no one's going to give away like a good quality product for free if there wasn't something wrong with it, as it were. But yeah, I think buying from trusted sources is definitely a safe bet in terms of where to go for fiber if you're looking for good fiber. And the second thing is don't skimp out on the prep. So just because you bought a bat, or just because you bought Rolags or whatever, that you think, oh, that's already been prepped in a way that's different from like just a top, doesn't mean that you still don't have some prep to do before you start spinning. And especially if you're new to spinning, I think pre-drafting is a huge thing that can really help with you to just take one less thing out of the things that you have to do when you're actually physically spinning. So when you're spinning, you're not only having to draft, you're also having to pedal and like your hand motions at the same time. Like you have to like keep track of all of that. And initially it's quite a lot to have to like think about at the same time. So if you pre-draft your fiber, then it makes the drafting part when you're actually spinning a lot smoother and less of a fight. I find it there again, kind of like with new knitters, when new spinners start spinning, like you kind of have a death grip. You can end up having a bit of a death grip as you're getting more and more tense because you're trying to think of all the different things that are happening at the same time. So pre-drafting your fiber can help with that. No matter what fiber type you're using, if you're using a Rolag, a bat, top, roving, whatever it is, I think pre-drafting is definitely worth doing. I know it can be time consuming depending on how much fiber you're prepping, but it's definitely worth it.
I totally agree with you. I've never regretted that, taking that little bit of extra time before actually getting fiber onto the wheel or even onto the drop spindle. And also I feel it's a little bit like we do our swatching before we knit or crochet. I feel like there's time in that prep that lets you get to know the fiber a bit better. As you said, that's kind of in deference to your future self and just make it a little bit easier. And a beginner too, I agree, a beginner could really benefit from just knowing what that fiber feels like in hand during that process.
Also, it's when you're pre-drafting as well, you get a feel for how long that staple length is, because you will by accident at some point, especially if you're a beginner, draft out too much and break the staple length and be like, oh, okay, that was too much. And then that will, as you're drafting, you'll notice you'll get that distance between the hands will start to come naturally as you're pre-drafting, and then that will be the same distance between your hands that you'll have when you're spinning that fiber, somewhat, like roughly. So like if you are doing like a standard like short forward draw or something like that. So it's just one of those things that the prep can really help in the actual spinning side of it as well.
Gotcha. I love it. I'm going to try another share, and we're just going off script today because we can. This is what happens when,
why not?
when the hosts are playing around. So I'm going to share from your Instagram account.
Go for it.
A photo that I found. Let me know if you guys can see Mina's Instagram photo here.
Oh yeah.
So I know this about you, but some others may not. You've also taken on watercolors and painting not long ago, probably about a year or so, right?
About a year and a half ago, yeah.
Yeah, so what we're looking at now is some of Mina's beautiful painting, watercolor painting work printed onto items. We actually have some of these items in the Fluff to Stuff Redbubble shop. And this photo on your Instagram account drew my eye because the colors in here, to me, are so you. There's a lot of what you love in color that I've seen in your fiber work that's expressed here in your painting as well. Is that pretty accurate? Would you say this is a pretty good Mina palette here?
Yeah, rainbow, basically. Like I always joke when people ask me what my favorite color is, I'm like, does rainbow count as a color? Is that a suitable answer?
It does. It's your favorite, your rules. But yeah, this is another expression. So what role does color play for you when you're picking a spinning project, either to spin, so the fiber that you choose, or in how you turn that hand spun yarn into a project? What role does color play?
I think color is definitely one of the first things I think about in terms of like, especially when it comes to like picking out a fiber. There's certain things that will always jump out to me when it's when I see certain colors together, like certain color palettes, as it were. Like I love, as much as I love rainbows, I also absolutely love like jewel tones or autumnal colors. Like those are sorts of the things that I naturally gravitate to. So if you were to look at my fiber stash, which you can't actually see unfortunately right now, it would be a lot of those things. It would be rich, saturated colors. Like you won't find a lot of pastels in my stash, yarn or fiber. I'm not a pastel person. I have neutrals because I love color so much, sometimes all that color can be a little bit intense and a little bit too much. So I like pairing them with neutrals, and I prefer things like gray neutrals and rather than cream neutrals, as it were. Like I like cooler neutrals and warm neutrals, and yeah, so color does play a huge part in it, and it kind of depends what I'm spinning for and what I'm going to want to do with that fiber at the end of the day. So If I want to do a project where I want to keep the colors in the color order that they are, then I might think about doing a chain ply to kind of maintain the color gradient. Or if I really want to mix things up, I might decide to do something like a fractal spin where you kind of really mix up the colors. But I think it also depends what I want to do with the finished yarn as well, and then that will have that will feed into the decision making of how I'm going to spin the fiber. And sometimes if it's just a fun spin, then I might just try something different, something I haven't done before, and just see how things go, just have fun with it. That's kind of the joy of spinning for me, and how I've treated it since I've started, is just treating each spin a bit like an experiment. Like there was one I did recently. I was spinning some fiber that I'd prepped months ago. I just, for some reason, hadn't sat down to spin it. And it was going to become socks. I was going to spin for sock yarn. And I was just going to do it as a chain ply because that's how I've done it all along. And then I was partway through spinning the fiber, like hadn't really gotten that far into it. And I was like, you know, I've never done a traditional 3-ply because my wheel has a lazy cake that only takes 2 bobbins. I've never done a traditional 3-ply. Why not? Let's do it. So at that point, I kind of weighed the fiber I had left, kind of guessed at how much fiber was on the bobbin already, and kind of divided it up to be 3 bobbins. And I went ahead and I jerry-rigged a lazy cape for the 3rd bobbin, and I did it because why not? Life's too short, might as well have fun with it. I was like, I've done a chain ply, I've done a 3-ply, a chain plied sock yarn before, and it's worked out fine, but I've never done a traditional 3-ply, so why not do that? Now, did the colors turn out quite how I wanted? Probably not, because I hadn't prepped the fiber with that in mind. I'd prepped it with the chain ply in mind, going, okay, the way I prep the fiber, I would end up with like micro stripes, so really thin stripes. Right. So it's ended up like sort of muddying the colors a lot more than I necessarily would have wanted, but I actually don't mind it. It's not bad. It's not so muddy that I think it's ugly or anything like that. I will still use it and it's great. But awesome. It's just one of those things. It's kind of like I try to keep the spinning fresh and interesting by just experimenting.
Well, I love hearing the way you organically move through a project like that and just go with what's happening at the moment, how you're feeling about the fiber as you're working with it. And I know that as a designer, you probably get accustomed to sometimes midway making another decision and just using what you have to its best. I love that. We have some questions for you coming from the chat, and I think we'll just do like a little rapid fire setup. Thanks to those of you asking questions in the chat. So Cheryl wants to know, how long does it take you to spin 4 ounces of fiber? She feels like Cheryl feels like it takes a really long time. So it's curious about that for you.
So it depends what I'm spinning. If I'm spinning for like a fingering weight, like a 3-ply or chain ply, then yeah, it will take me longer. If it's going to be something like a 2-ply DK to worsted weight, then it'll take me a lot less time. So it could range anything from a few hours up to a few days. Like it really just depends, and also depends how much time I put into actually doing it. So I think, for example, this sock yarn that I spun up, the traditional 3-ply, I probably did this over the span of about a week of like spinning most of those days, not the whole day obviously, but like a few hours each day over the span of about a week. Whereas a 100 grams or 4 ounces that I spin up as a somewhat woolen spun, like a modified long draw 2-ply thicker yarn, I could do that probably in less than 3 hours because it's just a lot quicker. And also, there again, if you know me from my knitting, you'll know that I'm a fairly fast knitter, and equally I'm a fairly fast spinner. I mentioned it before, I don't have a lot of patience for things that take long.
Your speed comes from wanting the outcome.
Yeah, I am very much outcome driven, or product driven, as it were. I think I'm more of a product knitter and therefore a product spinner. As much as I enjoy the process, and believe me, there have been times where I've literally fallen asleep while spinning because it's been so relaxing. I'm literally nodding off at the wheel while I'm spinning. I'm like, okay, I need to stop now. But
Yeah, the thing about timing is, I think if you work enough projects, you'll get some idea of what slow or fast feels like, or what a short project versus a long spinning project feels like. So there's a dependency there for many of us in, how many have we done? Some of our speed is based on how well we're working with that fiber, or to your point, what thickness are we going for? There's a lot of
yeah,
dependency. I didn't realize when I did my first traditional 3-ply, how long it takes to spin 3 fine singles before you get to the point of being able to ply them together. It was almost shocking to me what a slog it felt like to think, I've got 2 more bobbins of this to do.
it does take a while, it really does. But I've gotten to that point with my spinning now, where when I'm spinning my singles, once I get going and I'm in the rhythm of it, I can literally put on a movie and watch a movie. And much like with my knitting, I can spin without looking too much.
Okay.
Like how I've gone to the point with my knitting. If I'm knitting just like vanilla socks, for example, I can do that in the dark at the cinema because I don't need to look at what I'm doing. I can do it just by feel. And I'm kind of getting to that point now with my spinning to a certain degree, where I can be spinning and I could be looking off to the side and like watching a screen, for example, and spin and like maintain a certain level of consistency.
Excellent.
I don't obsess about consistent spinning. I don't obsess about my yarn having to be perfectly even the whole way through. I really don't. Like, I actually enjoy it when hand spun is slightly thick and thin, because I think that's part of the joy of it being hand spun, is that we're not machines for people. So a little bit of imperfection is part of the magic of it. It's part of the experience. It's just part of the way it looks. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I really like barber poled yarns that do look like this, that look a little bit crazy, because there again, that's not the sort of thing you get with hand-dyed yarn, because that you can't get that with hand-dyed yarn. It just doesn't work that way. And the yarns that you can buy that are commercially produced that look like this is because they've dyed the fiber and then mill spun the yarn to make it look like hand spun. So it's just not, it is something that's very unique to hand spun. So like I said, going back, I went a bit off topic there. I don't fuss about trying to be consistent. It never even occurred to me to try and focus on consistency when I was first learning to spin. I just wanted to make yarn that actually looked like yarn.
Yeah, there's freedom in that. We've got a couple questions in the chat about your favorite fiber prep. So if you were to purchase some fiber, do you prefer bats, Rolags, combed top? What do you like?
When I was learning to spin, Rolags were my absolute favorite. Absolute favorite. I found I was able to spin thinner a lot easier with Rolags than I was with any other kind of fiber prep when I was first learning. So in terms of getting the most bang for your buck, as it were, in terms of getting as much yardage out of fiber as you could, I got that from Rolags when I was first learning. Now I'm more able to get similar sort of yardages from other fiber preps as well, just from experience and just having gotten better at it over time. But I definitely felt that as a beginner, Rolags felt like magic. And again, with the pre-drafting really helps with that as well. And also using good Rolags is really key. But I absolutely love bats. I love all different types of fiber preps for different reasons. I love bats for fun spins because they're really quick. If you spin them more woolen style, they can be quite quick, spun like chunky and thick and thin, or they're really fun for like coarse spinning. I haven't done a huge amount of it, but every now and again, if I want a challenge, I'll do a bit of coarse spinning and practice a new skill. Or also, another thing that I heard when I was learning, and this kind of factors into why I like bats as well, is once you learn to spin thin, it can be hard to spin thick again, because once you've gotten the muscle memory to spin thin, it can be harder to spin thicker yarns. So what I would do, and what I still do, is like in between spinning thinner yarn projects, I will spin a bat and I'll spin like a thick chunky yarn, or like a DK weight yarn, or something thicker and fun and fast, as it were. And you know what, and the way I think about it is like, I might not know what this is going to be, but at the end of the day, it could always be a hat, and I can give it to someone as a present. Like, it can always be a hat. So I kind of use bats as kind of like palette cleansers between projects, and I really love it for that. But then I also love tops and roving, and I don't have a hard and fast favorite, but I think my first favorite was Rolex when I was first learning. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I love it. And Anne has a great question too, which I'll get to in just a moment. I want to make sure that our viewers and our friends here know that Mina is a prolific knitwear designer. And I feel like a personal fan of yours. I am starting in the world of design, and it just is so admirable to me, the way you approach knitwear design. So you've designed many different types of garments and accessories. And I know that among those designs, you have some that are well suited to hand spun yarn. So I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about the considerations that you make as a designer when encouraging people to use hand spun for one of your designs.
So the projects that I've designed specifically with hand spun in mind, or the ones that I think are suitable for hand spun, are usually designed more as a recipe than as a strict, you need to have X amount of yards to knit this project kind of thing. It's treated more as a recipe. And typically there'll be accessories. I don't think I have a hand spun garment design yet, although maybe one day. But yeah, so it's usually things like shawls and things like that. And the way that I approach it is, like I said, to treat it more like a recipe, or to kind of let the knitter know that you need to be at a certain point in your knitting, like you need to have a certain number of stitches that is a multiple of whatever before you move on to the next section. So I'm kind of like almost breaking it down to almost the design level, as it were, so that you're kind of moving along like I do when I'm designing a project. But I give you all the information that you need to figure it out and to knit as long as you have yarn. And that originally started even before I was a spinner. And that started from a place of me wanting the knitter to use up as much of their yarn that they're using for a project as possible. So for something like a shawl, I know people don't typically swatch for shawls. People don't typically check their gauge when it comes to shawl knitting, because let's be honest, I don't think I ever have. So, you know, I can't exactly expect others to be doing it if I'm not doing it, which is fair. I'm fairly typical. Like I said, I don't think anyone does. So it'd be like, okay, well, you knit section 1 until you've used up 30% of yarn A. Then you move on to section B until you've used up X amount percentage of this yarn and that yarn. And at the end, you should have used up, let's say, 90% of the yarn A, 100% of yarn B, and maybe 70% of yarn C. So you have minimal leftovers. You don't have like huge chunks of yarn left over. And even then, like, I try to have it be less than that. But I try to deal with percentages and allowing the knitter to basically make it as big as they can to use up as much of their yarn. But equally, if they want to make it smaller, they can adjust it that way as well. And then it also allows the knitter to adjust for yarn weights. So the pattern might have been knit at a DK weight, where you could use a thicker yarn or a thinner yarn because it's all knit with percentages. So that's,
I think really, many of us who've spun our fair share of very individual hand spun skeins would appreciate a recipe like that, because then you don't necessarily need to spin for the whole project. You might be able to combine hand spun skeins that you already have and still make it work into something beautiful. So I love that approach. I think too that the idea that you have about exploring the patterns that you described, to me, sound like an exploration for a knitter to really understand how to put together yarns in a project and how to use what you have, which I think is great.
And that's kind of been expanded. Like I keep forgetting I did this, but I published a book last year, self-published a book last year. And the designs were all Colorwork cowls. And it was, again, based on this whole concept of you can knit any of these designs at any gauge in a few different styles and a few different methods. And I had 2 of my sample examples knit up using hand spun mixed with commercial yarn. And that's one of my favorite things to do with hand spun, is to knitted up alongside a commercial yarn of a similar, quote unquote, similar weight. It doesn't have to be exact, it really doesn't. It'll be fine. But I think it's an amazing way to kind of use handspun in a way that keeps it really fun. Because personally, I don't know about you, but I find spinning colorful yarns a lot more interesting than spinning miles and miles and miles of like a gray yarn, for example. So I would much rather spin the funky rainbow yarn and then pair it with a gray neutral yarn that I've bought, that's been commercially spun, and pair those together into a project. And I feel like that's a really fun way to use up handspun. And I noticed it came up in the chat. Bex mentioned that I have a sweater that I designed called the Forage sweater, which is a raglan sweater which has like some color work in the yoke area. And that's a great example of somewhere you could chuck in some handspun just in that one area. You'd probably need maybe one skein would be enough for most sizes, maybe two, depending what size you're knitting. Or you could even use different, because it's literally, the color work is like a chevron pattern, and there's like several rows of that chevron pattern. So for however many rows, you could use different skeins of handspun. If you have lots of like half skeins, for example, like 50 gram or 2 ounce braids of or skeins of handspun and stuff. So I think color work is a really fun way to use up handspun in knitting, because you can play with the color and you can match it with a commercial yarn, and that's a great way to extend how far your handspun will go.
I love that. You know, just because I can, I'm going to go ahead and share an image of that, because I think it's, again, speaking to, I want to make sure that you can.
Yeah, so that's the sweater.
It's speaking to the freedom that you can have, even for beginners, to use up the handspun that you've created. I've really enjoyed projects where handspun is combined with commercial yarn. First of all, to be able to use up most of a braid of handspun, there's a special magic to that. And it just adds interest, exactly like you said. If you're doing a colorwork yoke like there would be in the Forage sweater, there likely is not going to be another sweater like yours if you use your handspun. And I think that's kind of cool. So I love that you're offering that to the community by way of your design. I think that's awesome.
I feel like a lot of
links. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think a lot of designs are fairly adaptable to be used with handspun. I think the reason why I see it so as being somewhat quote unquote simple is because I am a designer, so I think about it from that perspective, and it doesn't scare me to make those sorts of adjustments. Whereas I know for a lot of knitters who don't want to have to even think about that, the idea of having to make adjustments like that, or think about changing the gauge of a pattern and stuff, can be quite intimidating, which is why I think shawls and accessories are a great way to begin with, a great place to begin with when it comes to using up your handspun, because there's less of that intimidation of like, oh my god, is it going to fit at the end of the day? Because a shawl's a shawl, it's just going to be a bit bigger or a bit smaller, it's still a shawl. A hat's a hat. I mean, okay, fair enough. With a hat, there might be some fit issues, but like a cowl's a cowl. You know, a cowl's a cowl at the end of the day. As long as it goes around your neck, that's all that matters. You know, so I think it's. I
think that's just a less stress view of this craft. I want to make sure I give this compliment out loud that was shared by Leanne. Leanne says it was your spinning videos on YouTube that inspired Leanne to finally start using handspun yarn. And Leanne says, I would always spin and then worry I wouldn't have the yardage or gauge, etc. So watching your videos and now with your patterns as a way to use up handspun, I want to make sure you know that you're making a beautiful impact. We have a couple related questions in the chat to one of our top 5, which is, Anne is asking, do you have any precious stash of fiber or handspun?
I do.
So little handspun so far, and I'm trying to keep myself from saving up all the good stuff. So what's your favorite?
I don't think I have any handspun that I consider like too precious to knit. I don't have anything that I've spun where I'm like, oh, I don't want to touch that. If I've spun something and I'm really happy with it, I'm like, I want to knit that. because I want to show it off. I don't want it to just sit in a cupboard and not be seen by anybody. So I don't want to like sort of take a break right to go grab stuff, but maybe afterwards I can go grab it.
Yeah, when we have our show and tell,
maybe I'll go grab it. So
I know you have some favorite dyers, fiber dyers that you like. I know that.
Yeah, I will get to that in a second. But because of like stash of like fiber that I have, that I'm a little bit not scared to spin, but I want to spin it the right way, as it were. Like I don't want to just treat it like an experiment, because this isn't fiber I can get very easily. And I got really lucky a couple of years ago. I managed to get one of the Christmas calendars, the 12 Days of Christmas calendars from Fiberworks. They're really hard to get hold of. I don't know how I managed it, but I managed to get one. And so that's kind of like really special stash for me. And I think I also managed to get a couple of their braids of fiber on a D-stash. But again, like it's stuff that's not really easy for me to get, especially now, post-Brexit. It's not something I'd be able to order from the US, because I know I will definitely get hit by customs and stuff like that. So that fiber is very special, and I'm not scared of spinning it because I know I'll enjoy it, but I'm waiting until I know exactly what I want to make with the yarn before I spin it, sort of thing. I don't want to spin it without knowing what it's going to be. So it's kind of waiting until I've decided on that one. But yeah.
And you have some dyers that you love. You have some prep that you love. You also make your own row legs to combine colors and things like that. So it sounds to me like you can create your own soulful stash by putting together fibers that you enjoy.
If I can share some of the UK dyers or UK fiber producers that I really love, like there are 3 main ones that I can think of off the top of my head. There's probably more, but these are the first 3 that popped to my mind and who I've probably purchased from the most. The first one is Fellview Fibers here in the UK. Fellview Fibers. She has hands down the best Rolags I have ever spun. I was very fortunate. Hers were the first Rolags I ever spun. And I think I was spoiled because like even my Rolags are nothing compared to her Rolags. Her Rolags are amazing. They're so well created. I think she uses like a really fine gauge blending board. There's the word. So she gets really beautifully smooth Rolags. And they're such a joy to spin, so beautiful. I have actually ordered some Rolags for her, which will be a future prize in a future month of Fluff to Stuff. So stay tuned for that. And then the second is Spin Jones. Again, I've ordered from her quite a lot, actually. I think she's probably one of the ones I've ordered from the most. I love her bats. I also like her top and her other stuff, but her bats, again, are just absolutely beautiful. And I have a couple of those as prizes for this week, which will be coming later. And the third one is Hilltop Katie. And again, she has really beautiful gradient braids and lots of different types of preps. And both her and Spin Jones occasionally do sort of like, what do you call it? Like bits and bobs, like bags of like little random bits of fiber that they have left over from bigger projects that they were creating. And so those are always really fun to get. And then I blend them up on the blending board and create Rolags or mini bats and whatever. And they're really fun to play around with as well, because you know they're really good fiber. It's just then you can play around with that and do something else with it. So those are 3 that I can think of that are UK based that I really enjoy purchasing from. There are obviously so many others out there, but obviously John Alvin Textiles, that goes without saying, but I wouldn't that's different. I kind of feel like that's different. But yeah.
Is Hilltop Katie, is that Hilltop Cloud Fibers?
Yes. Hilltop, sorry, I was getting it muddled up because she's Hilltop Katie on Instagram. So I would say Hilltop Katie because of that, but it's Hilltop Cloud is the name of the company.
So I'm including that information, kind of Mina's top 3 in the chat, and I'll also make that available for those of you watching on YouTube. It will be in the description bar so that if you are in the UK or don't mind shopping from the UK, you can spin along with some of Mina's favorites. This is fantastic. I think we had one more question in the chat, also from Anne, and I'm curious about this too. Anne was asking, do you have kind of a default spin, a typical spin, or is every spinning project pretty different when you get to the wheel?
It's interesting. I do have a bit of a default spin, but I feel like my default spin is changing. It's interesting. This is one thing I've noticed, it's starting to shift. So my default spin used to be a 2-ply sort of sport weight yarn. My default now is, if it's just a 2-ply and I'm spinning from like a top, it's definitely more of a 2-ply fingering weight. But if I'm spinning from a bat and I'm going for a slightly thicker finished yarn, it'll be, the default will be like a DK to worsted weight. That seems to be where I'm at.
Very, very knittable, very crochetable too for projects.
Yeah.
Won't take
but
as
again,
long.
like, it's not super smooth, it's not super perfect. There's nothing like perfectionist about it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other questions from our folks that have joined us on this month's meeting? You all get priority when it comes to questions in the chat. Or you can come off mute if you like. I'll give it a few seconds if anyone has a question they'd like to ask Mina. Okay. I don't see any popping up. Mina, thank you so much. I think we all quite a bit, because the idea you had a couple of years ago to spin and make along together and use up our fiber has now resulted in this beautiful community effort. So thanks for being our special guest this month.
Absolutely.
It's my pleasure to go through this adventure with you. And thank you all for those who've joined us. Stick around if you're on the Zoom, but for those joining us on YouTube, we'll say goodbye for now. Thanks for being here.